Hey, what's up, people? Welcome to my review and in-depth analysis of the awesome television series known as The Chronicles of Young Indiana Jones. Now, this show is very dear to my heart. I grew up watching this show, and I have very fond memories of this show. And I just think that this show is so overrated and it's underappreciated. And I wanted to review this show. And I'm going to talk about basically my favorite episodes in this series. I can't cover the entire show because that would take forever. So I'm just going to give a summary of my feelings and the sentiments that I have in regards to this show. And I will do a review and analysis of my favorite episodes. So why do I think this show is so awesome? I think this show is an amazing piece of television. I feel like the filmmakers, George Lucas and his associates, do a great job with a television budget for its time. This was like the early 90s. And I'm blown away by some of these action set pieces, in particular the ones that depict World War I. So those episodes are my favorite episodes out of this entire television series. So the way this show is laid out is you have the first season or the first box set, which is basically Indiana Jones when he was a kid. So let's think kind of like Phantom Menace. Episode 1, we're introduced to Anakin as a little boy. Well, the first box set, for the most part, except for like the last 3 or so episodes, Indiana Jones is a young boy. Now, I feel like this setup is a lot more accessible than, say, how Anakin was a young boy in The Phantom Menace. So if you haven't seen this television series, don't roll your eyes and think that it's going to be kiddie, excessively infantile and childish, because it's not. The only thing that's quote-unquote kiddie is that Indiana Jones is a young boy, right? However, one thing that I love about this show, one thing that I really love about this show is that each episode is like, it's like a time capsule into a significant and important point in history. Indiana Jones comes across an important historical figure, and I love that because not only is this show highly entertaining, but it's also highly educational. And if you purchase the box sets, the DVD box sets, there's 3 of them, they are loaded with tons of bonus features pertaining to history, tons of documentaries. I think each disc, which has like basically 2 episodes, which are now edited into one quote-unquote movie, and we'll talk about that very soon, so one disc has a movie, right, which is basically 2 episodes edited together. In addition to that movie, you also have 3 documentaries that are in there with trivia and all types of stuff. So if you're a fan of bonus features, you should really pick up this set because these bonus features are awesome documentaries that really just are so educational. Like, this would be a great educational tool for a history teacher, right? Maybe a history teacher that is teaching junior high students. This would be an awesome tool to educate your students in World War I history and the history of the early 19th century. And yeah, so I really love this show. And so for the most part, the first season is Indiana Jones as a young boy. And I appreciate it. It's not corny. It's not kiddie. There's no antics like Jar Jar Binks. Like I said, it's not infantile. It's not juvenile in any shape, form, or fashion. But the whole reason why I bring it up is because I want to distinguish between the first box set and box sets 2 and 3, which are, I guess, seasons 2 and 3, right? So I prefer seasons 2 and 3 because Indiana Jones is a man. He's a young man in those, right? So he's able to do more adventures and engage in more violent type of scenarios. So I just like box sets 2 and 3 better. And I love it primarily for the fact that Indy fights in World War I. And The execution is amazing. Like, I'm talking about, like, it's awesome. When I think of awesome films or television series that depict World War One, this one immediately comes to mind. And the fact that this came out in the early 90s and that it still holds up today, it's amazing. Like, I popped this in and I'm just blown away by how the action is executed for a television series. I mean, it's not graphic as far as like bloody, but it's just well done. Like, this is up there with All Quiet on the Western Front, the original film from me, and this is up there with the more contemporary, critically acclaimed film 1917. Like, this is awesome depiction of World War One. So that's the main reason why I love this series, right? So for the most part, box set 2 and the first half of box set 3 are all Indiana Jones fighting in World War One, and he goes all over the place. Now, is it realistic? No, but it's fun and it's educational. And what I mean by that is that he basically covers the entire war, right? He just keeps on moving around. And, you know, the narrative, the story does a good job as far as how it's able to put Indiana Jones in all these important scenarios all throughout World War One, and how he's able to encounter important historical figures, right? Awesome television series. I cannot praise this series enough. And another awesome thing about this is that the group of filmmakers involved, I mean, these are the same people that did Star Wars and primarily the prequels. I mean, you have Ben Burtt, who's the sound engineer. Ben Burtt, the one that did all the sound effects for Star Wars. You have George Lucas producing. You have the same cinematographer as the prequels. You have the same producer as the prequels. It's classic Lucasfilm, and it's overlooked, right? I don't hear enough people talking about this show, and to me, this is Lucasfilm at its height. This is the golden age of Lucasfilm. It's part of the golden age of Lucasfilm, which was basically just, to me, everything just up to the prequels, right? And I'm not saying that the prequels suck because it's not part of my golden age. It's just, that would be like the silver age. It's just a different era, right? But this is part of that golden age. And another great thing about this show was that how it pioneered CGI, as far as utilizing CGI to recreate some of these important historical cities and set pieces, and being able to generate more cast. So, of course, since it's a television series, it's going to have a limited budget, but they were able to use CGI, and this was one of the first television series to use CGI in order to recreate huge cast, right? Kind of like, think about when you first saw Lord of the Rings, right? The Fellowship of the Ring, and then that opening sequence where there's that big war against Sauron. And I remember seeing that and being like, whoa. I mean, obviously, those aren't real extras, right? Fighting in a battle. They were created CGI. Well, this was one of the pioneers of that idea, right? And again, these pioneered special effects would eventually link themselves to the prequels, right? And you could see that if you look at some of the documentaries in the prequels, they make references to this show as far as how CGI was utilized to recreate some of these important historical set pieces. Now, I mentioned earlier that basically each disc, or the way this show is presented as far as now, there's 2 episodes that are edited together into one movie, right? So this is George Lucas once again with his revisionism, right? George Lucas, the revisionist. Just like George Lucas redid the original trilogy and is pushing his special editions, same thing here. So when this show originally aired on television in the early 90s, each episode would open up with a super old Indiana Jones that was missing one eye. He was like 90 years old, and if I can remember correctly, he would be like in a museum, just chilling. and he was old. He was like 90 and he had one eye missing. And I think what would happen is like a young cast member would go up to him and ask him a question, and this would be the setup for him to tell the story, and then the episode would begin. Well, all those little intros, those introductions with old Indiana Jones have been removed. Instead, what we have now is 2 episodes that are edited together and presented as a movie, quote unquote, right? So each disc has a 1.5-hour movie, but it's really 2 episodes edited into one, right? And am I furious about it? No, but it's totally obvious that that's what George Lucas did, because it's like you're watching this movie and then the first half is like has a specific tone and story, and then all of a sudden in the middle of the quote unquote movie it just shifts into an entirely different story and tone. So it's like it's totally obvious that that's not how this show was set up, that wasn't the original intention for it to shift dramatically in the middle of the quote unquote movie. And I don't know why George Lucas did that. I mean, the guy is weird as far as how he likes to be a revisionist and reconsiders things and wants to redo things and repackage them in a certain way. I mean, am I furious about it? No. But at the same time, I kind of miss those intros with old Indiana Jones with his missing eye, right? And I can't tell you, just getting a little sidetrack, I can't tell you how disappointed I was to hear that Indiana Jones didn't lose his eye in the most recent Indiana Jones film, The Dial of Destiny. That would have been awesome, right? But I don't think Disney even cares about this show, or even I don't think anybody there at Lucasfilm has even watched this show or even cares. You know how they are. They don't care about lore. They don't care about continuity or story. They're just trying to do their own thing, which sucks. So that's enough about that. So now this first episode that I'm about to review, this is one of my favorite episodes, okay? So the first episode that I'm about to review is called Trenches of Hell. And again, just like I previously stated, the way World War I is executed in this series is exceptional. The battles are amazing for a television series from the 90s. I want to put this show right up there with Miami Vice as far as being a television show that was able to achieve cinematic greatness before the arrival of HBO's Sopranos. Because now HBO pioneered television that's like movies with Sopranos, and it reached its peak with Game of Thrones, and now you got Breaking Bad and tons and tons and tons and tons of television shows that are like long movies, right? This is a whole new golden age of television right now. But for me, young Indiana Jones was able to achieve this before HBO to a certain degree, right? As well as Miami Vice. I love Miami Vice. Like, you watch Miami Vice and it feels like you're watching a movie. It doesn't feel like you're watching a television show. Right, you could watch another cop drama from the same era like NYPD Blue, and NYPD Blue straight up feels like television, but not Miami Vice. And the same thing is applicable to young Indiana Jones. I feel like I'm watching a movie. Like, this could be projected in a theater. This is a movie about World War I. The only thing that doesn't make it feel like a movie ultimately is the aspect ratio, because it's 4:3, because that's how television was in the early 90s. But if this was widescreen, oh my God, this would feel totally like something that could be projected in the cinema. So the first episode that I'm about to review, and one of my favorites, is Trenches of Hell, right? This was an awesome film that depicted, awesome episode rather, that depicted the brutality of fighting in the trenches of World War One, and there's also other episodes that do an exceptional job depicting trench warfare, how brutal no man's land is. But this episode, Trenches of Hell, definitely is one of the ones that comes to mind immediately. So this episode, Trenches of Hell, is about the real life historical battle known as the Battle of the Somme, right? And this battle was brutal. It lasted for something like 140 days. Almost 1 million people died just in this battle alone. And this was basically the French and the Belgian soldiers against the Germans. And it was just about gaining territory. And even though nearly 1 million people died in this battle, there was very little territory gained. So this is the perfect episode to depict the brutality, the senseless killing of World War One, right? And there's also a little bit of commentary on the war, the reason why it was fought within this episode. So again, that's the first half of the quote-unquote movie, because again, this is 2 episodes edited in one. The second half is about Indiana Jones trying to break out of prison because he's been captured, right? But as far as Trenches of Hell, as far as the first half that actually depicts trench warfare, again, this thing is exceptional, right? So the episode begins with young Indiana Jones enrolled in the Belgian army. Why has he been enrolled in this army? It's because he tried to enlist in other armies, but they wouldn't take him because he's too young. So what happens is Indiana Jones runs away from home, right? It happened in the first season, the first box set. And he runs away from home and he wants to enlist in World War One. And the Belgian army is the only one that will take him in. So that's why he's fighting for the Belgians. And he's using a different name. He's not going around saying, my name is Indiana Jones or Henry Jones. He's using an entirely different name. So it could be a little confusing if you just pop this in without watching the first box set. However, if you want to skip the first box set, you don't want to see young Indiana Jones as a kid, hey, I don't blame you. Right? I mean, I skipped the first box set. I don't even own the first box set. And that's not me saying that it sucks or anything. It's just that I want to see Indiana Jones as a young man fighting World War One. So I pop it in and I start right here. And it's easy to understand because it's all explained through expository dialogue, right? So at first, you're maybe a little confused, but I love it when television shows and films just hit the ground running. Just throw me in there. Don't over-explain and get too much expository exposition and all that stuff. Just throw me in there and then use the dialogue of the characters to fill back the backstory, because that's a good way to make dialogue and make scenes dramatic, right? So that's what's going on. Indy's using a fake name, and he's basically rolling through this whole war with his right-hand man, this fat friend of his named Remy, who I love. I love Remy. Remy is cool. He's hilarious. I love it when he gets pissed off because he gets really passionate. He really comes across as a true Frenchman that is fighting in World War One. He's a great comrade to young Indiana Jones. I love this Remy character. So the episode begins with all the main officers, all the leaders of the Belgian army have been killed. Every single one of them. And Indiana Jones has been leading the Belgian army. He's the leading officer. And I don't even think he is an officer. He's just taken upon himself to be the leader, right? And they're seeking aid from the French because the Belgians and the French are allies in World War One. And ultimately what happens is that the Belgians have to be led by a French commander, a French officer rather. And they're led by, I think it's Lieutenant Monroe, right? And there's a lot of tension built up because of that. Like the Belgians are basically like, well, why are we being led by a French? Why are we being led by a French officer? What's going on here? And the reason why is because it's going to take 3 weeks for Belgian officers to be sent to the front lines. So that's why that's going on. And there's this great protagonist in this episode. I call him Scarface because he has this scar on his face and he's antagonizing him. And him and young Indiana Jones are always butting heads. And it's alluded that he possibly may have murdered one of the Belgian officers. And that's why they're leaderless right now. And young Indiana Jones suspects him of that. And this guy, Scarface, man, he's a great villain, man. I mean, his acting, he really steps into this role and he's a menace. And I love how he just gets in young Indiana Jones' face and antagonizes him. You could tell this actor loved this role. And yeah, he was a great character. I enjoyed him. I enjoyed him as a villain. He was awesome. And again, I got to reiterate, the action is so impressive for an early 90s television series. I mean, you got bodies flying all over the place from explosions, and when they try to cross no man's land, just the brutality of the war for a TV show in the early 90s, man. Like, this is before, again, HBO, right? And there's no blood, but at the same time, it's pretty intense. And there's this one sequence where the Germans shoot gas. Right, I think it's mustard gas. They shoot gas, and all the protagonists, the Belgians, put on their gas mask, and there's one soldier that doesn't have his mask on him, and he's just all frantic and panicking because he's about to die from poisoning, for breathing in the gas. And he goes to young Indiana Jones, and he's like, "Give me your mask, please, please." And young Indiana Jones is like, "No, I can't, I'm not going to." And he literally has to watch this soldier die right before him and just die from breathing in this gas. And it was so brutal. And if you're watching this show as a young kid, I mean, this stuff stays with you, right? And that's why I have such reverence for this show. Another great action sequence was when the Germans this was immediately, I think, right after they shot that gas, they just bust out the flamethrowers, right? And it's a haunting image, right? I mean, and again, I'm just blown away by the fact that this is a television show made in the early 90s. And this haunting image that I'm referring to is when the Germans start to cross the no man's land, and they're using those flamethrowers and they're setting the Belgians on fire. They have these gas masks on, and some of them are riding on horseback with these gas masks on. And it totally, I mean, this feels apocalyptic. This feels like something out of like the book of Revelation, man. Like it's the end of the world. And I was just like, man, I can't, again, I'm just blown away that this was made in the early 90s and that this is part of the Indiana Jones canon. And, I don't know if Disney, how those idiots like to be like, this is not canon. But no, this is canon. Young Indiana Jones is canon for me, right? And it's awesome. Love this show. So we get a little R&R from young Indiana Jones and his comrades, so they're able to survive this attack by the Germans with the gas mask and the flamethrowers. And they get a little R&R, and they have a little camaraderie moment with the English, who are also fighting the Germans. And there's a little commentary about the war, and this one English soldier basically conveys that he feels that the war is all about profit, right? It's all about the Industrial Revolution and things of that nature. And even Indiana Jones says to him, he's like, well, if you're so cynical about the war, why do you keep fighting? And the Englishman says, because it's my duty, right? Just thought I'd throw that in there. I found that exchange to be interesting, right? And there's a moment where Indiana Jones says a poem about death. And it was a very touching moment. And again, this show is very serious in tone. At least these World War I years, right? It's very serious in tone. Don't expect any like jokes like you saw in Temple of Doom and any kind of family friendly moments like there was in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, because this thing is serious, right? So, and let's use this opportunity to talk about Sean Patrick Flannery's depiction of Indiana Jones, right? He does an outstanding job, right? Even though he acts nothing like Indiana Jones, like we see in the original films, right? He doesn't even act like River Phoenix did in the introduction to The Last Crusade, when River Phoenix played young Indiana Jones. You could tell that River Phoenix was channeling Harrison Ford's Indiana Jones with his facial gestures and the inflection of his line deliveries, and you believe, like, yeah, that's young Indiana Jones. Here, Sean Patrick Flannery, he's doing his own thing. He's not trying to copy Harrison Ford. He's not trying to copy Indiana Jones as seen in the movies. He's doing his own thing. And for some people, they may not like that. And, I kind of held on to that criticism, but I realized that when I watched this show, that even though Sean Patrick Flannery is not acting anything like the Indiana Jones that we know, what he is delivering is not bad at all. He is giving a very sincere performance, right? Like when you see his eyes and how he's affected by all this shit that he's seeing in World War I, you feel like he's really going through it. You could feel the pain that he's going through. You could see this character hardening, right, as he experiences this war. So even though he's not giving the same performance as River Phoenix did or Harrison Ford did, he's still giving a good performance nonetheless. And I got to give him props for that. I really do. I got to give him respect for that. And this is not the same thing as the Solo movie, where we have another actor playing another Harrison Ford character, and that guy was nothing like Harrison Ford. But it's not the same as far as an actor playing a Harrison Ford character in no way like him, because when he did it, it sucked. Like that guy tried to do his own thing, and I didn't like it. I thought he made Han Solo look like a puppy love, a wimp, right? I didn't like his performance. For the most part, I didn't like it. But here, as far as Sean Patrick Flannery, even though he's doing something entirely different than what we've seen, he's doing something entirely different. He's not trying to emulate Harrison Ford. What he is doing is pretty impressive. And the reason for that, as I previously stated, is because you really feel like he's going through these events in World War I. You see him hardening. You see him affected. You see the pain in his eyes. You see the sorrow of seeing all these people killed around him, right? And I got to give him respect for that performance. So as the story progresses, it turns out that Scarface didn't kill the captain, and Indiana Jones is able to finally realize that. And ultimately what happens is Indiana Jones is captured and he's sent to a prison camp, and he tries to escape, as well as other comrades with him, by digging an underground tunnel. But what happens is he ends up getting caught, and the Germans transfer him to this maximum security prison. And again, he tries to escape with two comrades who are Russian, and they try to use a rope to get out of there, and the rope breaks and his two comrades fall and die. But ultimately what happens, Indiana Jones ends up escaping by using coffins, by getting inside a coffin, because this maximum security prison was infamous for being inescapable. That's what the Germans were saying. There is absolutely no way you can escape this prison. So Indiana Jones is able to come up with this clever idea. Him and another comrade of his, they're able to come up with this awesome idea to hide in coffins. And when they transport the coffins out, presuming that there's a dead body in there, that's one way that they can escape. And yeah, this was totally recycled in the Clone Wars. If you remember that episode with Obi-Wan going undercover as some bounty hunter, changing his face, and he's trying to escape prison with Cad Bane and I forgot this other character. That's exactly what they do too. And I think this was Clone Wars. I think this was Clone Wars season 4. Yeah, the box. This was that whole the box arc, right? Where Obi-Wan's pretending to be a bounty hunter, and they do the exact same thing. They hide in coffins, and that was the way they were able to escape that prison. Well, the same thing happens here, and there's a moment of panic where the German soldiers say that they are actually not going to be burying the coffins. They're not going to bury them. They're actually going to be cremating them. And then Indiana Jones starts to freak out. And ultimately, he's able to escape, but his friend is caught. And that's the end of this episode or movie, whatever you want to call it. Trenches of Hell. And it was awesome. The next episode that I'm going to review, and one of my favorites, is the episode called Demons of Deception. So again, this is 2 episodes that have been edited together as a movie. However, I'm only going to be reviewing the first half because that episode is the true Demons of Deception. The second half is an episode called Paris. And again, they edit these 2 episodes together, and it just does not flow right into a movie, because the first episode or the first 45 minutes of this quote-unquote movie is like an epic war film, and then the last 45 minutes is like this humorous romance espionage film, and again the tones clash. So I'm only going to be reviewing the first half. So Demons of Deception, this was another outstanding episode. It's one of those episodes that you watch and you just can't believe that this was produced for television in the early 90s, because the production value is so epic, and just the depiction of World War I is some of the best stuff that I've ever seen. Again, whether it's television or cinema. Now, this episode deals with one of the most epic battles in World War I, called the Battle of Verdun. And over 1 million Frenchmen died in this battle over the course of 4 years. So this is just insane, this battle, right? And the way that it's depicted in this film, I mean, you truly are... This episode truly conveys a great sense of disparity when it comes to the soldiers fighting in this war and in this particular battle. And I absolutely love the music in this episode. The composer to this show is so underrated, because if you listen carefully, there is a lot of beautiful music in this series. But for this particular episode, I mean, the theme for that I really love is called Visiting Remy. And that song, that piece of music, is some of the best classical music that I've ever heard in my life. The theme is so haunting and it's so painful. And I'm just obsessed with this score, this particular piece of music called Visiting Remy. And I encourage all of you to check it out on YouTube. It's under the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles Original Soundtrack Volume 1, and Visiting Remy is at 6 minutes and 40 seconds. It's truly some beautiful music. And I should mention the composer by name. His name is Joel McNeely. This guy is a powerhouse. I absolutely love the music to this show and in this particular episode. And one important thing to note, or one interesting thing to note, is that Ian McDiarmid, he shows up in the second half of this quote-unquote movie in the Paris section, and he makes a cameo. So we got the Emperor himself cameoing in the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. And like I said in the introduction to this review, this show has a lot of that Star Wars, Lucasfilm Golden Era DNA. Because another important thing, or another interesting thing, little trivia here, is that part 2 of this movie, the screenplay is written by Carrie Fisher, Princess Leia herself. So if you want to see an interesting episode, like I said, that involves romance, comedy, and a little bit of espionage, check out the second half of this movie known as Paris. That's the true name for that episode, but now it's been edited into a movie called Demons of Deception. But back to the Demons of Deception portion of this beautiful episode or movie. So we have the French basically using the Belgians as couriers, as mailmen to deliver important messages to the front lines of this battle. And in this episode, it is truly conveyed that the French look down upon the Belgians and find them inferior. However, there's one general that has a conscience. And you're going to see in this episode that the generals really do not value a soldier's life, right? I mean, it is brought to their attention numerous times just how insane the deaths, the casualties are in this battle. And 3 out of 4 of the generals could care less. It's a meat grinder, this battle, right? However, there's one general that has a conscience, and he really is upset with his fellow peers and his colleagues for not valuing the life of a soldier. And I really like this character because he embodied the empathy that we as the audience feel, and he did an outstanding job, right? So the whole goal is to retake Fort Douaumont, and the soldiers just run into machine gun fire, and it's just insane. And like I previously stated, the generals, 3 out of 4 of them, could care less how many casualties. There's not enough deaths for these guys, right? They do not value the life of a soldier. And their attitude really reminds me of this Stanley Kubrick film that he made with Kirk Douglas called Paths of Glory. And in that film, basically, soldiers are getting killed in the same fashion, right? The officers could care less. However, there's one officer or a handful of officers that refuse to follow their superiors' orders to basically just purposely send their men to their deaths, with the objective just being meaningless, right? Because you cannot achieve the objective as far as this in this film. And what happens is basically the soldiers or the officers that were responsible for that decision get put in front of a firing squad. So, and I'm paraphrasing, I may be a little off or incorrect as far as some of those details, but from what I remember, that's the general gist of it. And this particular episode reminded me of that. And it's important to know that Indiana Jones is one of the couriers for the French. And he has, the episode starts out with him having a message saying to attack. And it's basically just a epic slaughter into no man's land. And there's this particular scene in this episode where a soldier, the music's playing, the classical music's playing, this epic score, and there's all this chaos and death all around Indy, and he's in the trenches, and one soldier kind of just goes up to him in despair, and he shows a picture of his wife and family, and he tells him to give this to her, or to contact her and tell her that he loves her and stuff. And Indy's, it's very, the way it's executed is very dramatic and very emotional. And I cannot praise the show enough because it's epic. In its execution, and the violence, the action, the way these explosions occur. And I know these aren't CGI explosions. So I really watched this episode and I was like, man, for people that like explosions, check this show out, because there's people flying all over the place. Again, I am just puzzled as to how this show had such an epic budget. And when I watched this show, the more I watched it, because I haven't watched it in 3 years, 4 years or something like that. And every time I come to a film again or a TV show again, I'm a different person and I'm seeing it with a different set of eyes. And I gotta honestly say, this is some of George Lucas's best work right here, as far as him putting out product, him putting out film or television shows. This is some of the best, right? I want to say this is up there with the Indiana Jones trilogy and the original trilogy. This show is underrated, because the more I watch it, the more I'm just blown away that this is not mentioned more. Young Indiana Jones Chronicles should be mentioned in discussions about George Lucas's great work. up there with the original trilogy, up there with Indiana Jones, the original 3 films, up there with American Graffiti and THX 1138. This show needs to be discussed as part of George Lucas's greatest works. Seriously. And Indiana Jones, he's just watching all these soldiers get murdered and blown to bits. And there's one sequence where you see the dead soldiers and there's all these rats that are just swarming all over them. And again, I just admire and really appreciate the production value because it's just nasty and you really feel like that's the way it was. And in the first sequence or the first half of this episode, this particular battle that Indy just witnessed, 600 of the French soldiers are killed. And Indy informs the soldiers of this as the courier, and they are, again, completely detached. They're more upset that no ground was gained, not even an inch, than the fact that 600 soldiers died. So they could send like 100% of their men to death, and if they didn't gain any ground, they could care less. All they care about is gaining ground. They do not care about the lives of the soldiers, except for one general, right? So there's this sequence where there's this dinner party and all these detached generals, all they care about is their dinner parties and their ballets. And again, the generals are furious that no ground was gained. And there's a sequence where the couriers, Indiana Jones and his fellow peers, they discuss what is this war about, right? And they go into the whole explanation, and it was very educational. Again, this is a very educational show, but at the same time, a lot of people ask, what was World War I truly about, right? And his peers, his fellow couriers, discuss it's basically about alliances that had to be honored after the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary by a Serbian nationalist. And it was funny because Indiana Jones says, after listening, he just says, "So, we're fighting to protect Serbia, a country no one's ever heard about?" And I thought, like, wow. I mean, when he put it like that, it was very, very just like, it really put some context in this conflict called World War I, because it was solely about alliances and colonies and empires. That's what it really was about. And it really, even though the Germans invaded France and I think Russia to protect, quote unquote, protect Serbia after this assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. Again, what Indy said, the whole setup was to protect Serbia, right? But it was more than that. It was about empires and colonies and all that stuff. And then we could get into how the Ottoman Empire got involved and all that stuff. But that comes later. I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about that because, again, this show takes the whole World War I conflict and it just puts you right there, right? It's a great educational show. So Indy finds Remy among the wounded at this hospital, and then that's where we get that epic music that I just previously talked about, that beautiful, beautiful score, that beautiful piece of music known as Visiting Remy. And this guy, this actor that plays Remy, man, he is such a great actor. This was such a great scene. So Remy is sitting there among the wounded, and you get to see some really gory stuff. And again, I'm just like, wow, this was on TV. This was on TV in the early 90s. So Indy visits Remy, and Remy's there, and he's just screaming. He's screaming at the nurses. He believes that the bullet is still inside of him, and he's like, get it out of me, get it out of me. And then Indy comes to calm Remy down, and then he asks Remy, he says, is the bullet really in you? And then Remy's like, nah, man, nah, it's not in me. He just doesn't want to go back to the front lines. So he's just making a scene because he doesn't want to go back, because he's so traumatized by all the death that he's seen. And I thought this was such a brilliant scene as far as acting, and it was so well done. And again, I can't praise this show enough. The more I watch it, the more pissed off I get that this show is not regarded as some of George Lucas's greatest contributions to TV and film, really. So after this beautiful scene, Indiana Jones is attacked by a German warplane as he's delivering a message, and this was such an epic scene. And again, when I watched this, I really questioned how they were able to achieve this. How was Lucasfilm able to achieve this with a television budget? Because it felt like I'm watching a film in the cinema. It's just epic. The action, the set pieces, the directing, everything. It was brilliant. So one sequence that takes place after this that has stuck with me since I was a little kid is this whole Big Bertha thing. So again, I was educated while I watched this, and Big Bertha stuck with me forever after I watched this as a little kid. So what is Big Bertha? Big Bertha are these huge German guns that can basically shoot a 200-ton shell. Right, so there's a sequence where Indiana Jones, he's introduced to these huge guns by the French, and they're like, yeah, this gun right here could shoot a 100-pound shell, and then he talks about an even bigger gun, and he's talking about Big Bertha, which could shoot a 2,000-ton shell or something like that, and it was just insane. And after this, Indiana Jones is given a job as a spy because he speaks German. And his mission is to cross no man's land and find out if the Germans are bringing new kinds of weaponry. And when Indiana Jones does that, when he does this little spy job, he finds out that the Germans are bringing 2 Big Berthas. And what this means is that the French, they have no choice. They are going to get completely annihilated. They are going, and that's why they call this the meat grinder, right? That's what this was, this battle. Now, even though Indiana Jones lets the generals know this knowledge, this piece of knowledge that he discovered as a spy, the generals do not give a crap. And the good general, the one good general, he even does aerial reconnaissance. And he has actual proof, because initially they didn't believe Indiana Jones. They didn't want to believe him. They came up with every excuse to not believe him. That he was Belgian, that he can't be trusted, maybe he's exaggerating, maybe he overheard incorrectly. But the good general actually does some aerial reconnaissance, has evidence, and the generals still don't care. They still don't care, and it's a maddening experience. This episode was really good at making you care about the good people in this episode, and it does a really good job in making you hate these generals for having such little regard for the life of a soldier. So even though that one good general has proof that there are 2 Big Berthas, the other generals don't care. Now, the good general ends up writing a message to end the attack. And contrary to that the one head general, like the head of the whole pyramid, says, no, we are going to have this attack. I do not care. So the reason why he doesn't care is because he believes that this battle has more to do with national image than it does with the actual lives of the soldiers. So again, it's all politics. It's all political interest. It's what the battle means rather than the actual objective. And Indiana Jones is given the order to reattack, and he's given this order by the generals that don't care, and instead, Indy decides to take it upon himself to go AWOL, and he fakes his death. So he gets on his bike as the courier, and He destroys his bike, makes it look like he was blown away by one of those German warplanes, and he goes AWOL. And that's how this episode ends. Great episode. I mean, this episode stuck with in my memory ever since a kid. When I think of World War I think of this particular episode, especially the scenes in No Man's Land and just how brutal it was. So I'm just going to talk briefly about this second half of this quote-unquote movie, the portion known as Paris, the one that Carrie Fisher wrote. So really quick, man. Indiana Jones is on leave. He's able to integrate himself into the Belgian army again, and he goes on leave. There's a brief opening where him and Remy are fighting on the front lines, but he goes on leave. They go on leave, rather, together, him and Remy. They go to Paris. They get to chill with some ladies, and Indiana Jones falls in love with this famous dancer, and it turns out that this woman can possibly be a spy. So as a result of this, he gets arrested by the French police. And then they find out that he's lying about his identity because he's using a fake name as a result of enrolling in the Belgian army, because that was the only army that would take him in because he was so young. And he's accused of being a spy. So essentially, he's in love with a woman who is a spy. And it doesn't work out, and as a result of him getting arrested, his leave is canceled, and he's sent back to the front, right? Now, this episode was a total, break from the previous episodes that had a lot of action, a lot of death, a lot of disparity. This episode was more about comedy and romance, espionage and intrigue. Now, I wouldn't say that it was a terrible episode. I wouldn't say the episode sucked. I think it was a good episode, right? But if you expect it to be some high-octane World War I war film, it's not like that, this episode. It's not like that at all. It's just we're slowing down here, which is fine, because you got to remember, this is a show with tons and tons of hours, right? I mean, lots of hours incorporated into it, so not every episode is going to be some big action epic battle, right? So, but for the most part, Demons of Deception, an outstanding episode, highly recommended. One of the prime examples as to why this show is awesome. Now, I want to briefly talk about the next episode of the next movie, which is called The Phantom Train of Doom. I'm going to skip over the first episode in this movie and emphasize and talk about the second episode, which I thought was a great adventure. It felt like classic Indiana Jones. It had some awesome action pieces, some great humor, some great Indiana Jones humor, and it was just a great adventure and a great spectacle. So just really briefly, I want to talk about it. And there's not much, this episode isn't very deep as far as themes, but nevertheless, it's a great episode, especially when it comes to adventure and action. Now, a very interesting thing about this episode is that it's written by Frank Darabont, who is George Lucas's friend and who is basically famous for writing and directing the critically acclaimed film, The Shawshank Redemption. So it was great for him to contribute to this episode and contribute to this wonderful series. So in this portion of the movie, Indiana Jones and Remy, again, I love Remy. He's a great sidekick to Indiana. They basically end up accidentally kidnapping a high-ranking German officer known as Colonel Paul von Vorbeck, right? And this German officer is highly regarded, highly respected as a master strategist. And they basically end up kidnapping him in a hot air balloon. And there was some great action. I mean, it feels cinematic. It feels like something right out of a movie. I mean, you got motorcycles leaping into the air and explosions and all types of stuff. And I thought it was humorous. So humorous that this colonel, reminds Indiana Jones of his father because he's very strict and he's scolding Indiana. He's saying things like, you guys are idiots for not having a plan in regards to kidnapping him. They don't have a destination. Indiana Jones doesn't have a compass, and he's scolding them like they're idiots. And Indiana's like, man, it's like kidnapping my father. I thought that was hilarious. And basically, the episode starts out with Indy and his fellow comrades and Remy. They're basically disguising themselves as peasants, and they end up getting in a hot air balloon and encountering a pride of lions and having to basically survive by eating giant termites. And they encounter some angry African natives, and it's just basically a thrilling, exciting chase sequence across the African savannah, right? Because the German officer, Colonel Paul von Vorbeck's men are trying to find them. And basically, they're all in this hot air balloon. Indiana, Remy, and the Colonel. And there was an awesome, basically, action sequence that involves this female fighter pilot, this German female fighter pilot, and this hot air balloon. And again, I'm just blown away by how cinematic this all feels. And it feels like something that should be in a movie projected in the cinema. And ultimately, they keep on getting holes in the hot air balloon because of all the bullets and everything. And then Indiana Jones has to get glue and patches and quickly try to patch him up while he's being shot at. And it's exciting. Like I said, it's a great adventure. And the Germans are constantly chasing them, and ultimately what happens is Indiana has to let the Colonel go. So they finally lose the hot air balloon because they run out of patches. The Germans are coming. The female fighter pilot's there, and there's a standoff where Indiana has the gun pointed at the Colonel, and the Colonel basically asks him, what are you going to do? And then Indiana is like, hey man, we ended up accidentally kidnapping you, so this isn't even my mission. The only thing that we can do is survive, because there's nothing they could do. They're outnumbered, right? There's dozens and dozens of German soldiers coming, and they're going to kill Indiana if he decides to kill the Colonel. And ultimately, Indiana lets him go. But as a gesture of goodwill, Colonel Paul von Vorbeck gives Indiana his compass. So I thought that was a nice gesture. And basically that's the general gist of the episode. There's not a lot of deep themes, heavy themes like in the previous episodes I discussed that involve trench warfare and things of that nature. However, like I said, this was a great adventure and I highly recommend this episode. It was exciting, pure Indiana Jones goodness right here. Now, another one of my favorite episodes in this series is Aganga, the giver and taker of life. I remember seeing this episode as a young kid, and certain images in this particular episode stuck with me forever. Images of an entire village of Africans dead with smallpox, and how one little boy was a survivor, and how this was a big controversy because Indiana Jones's superior officer wanted to leave the child behind. So that's an image that stuck with me forever. And yes, this episode, it's not really big on the action, but there's a lot of drama and a lot of great performances. So this episode starts out with Indiana being a lieutenant, leading Africans who are fighting on behalf of the Belgians against the Germans. And now, this episode and the documentaries on the disc for the DVD release were so educational as far as the context, the historical context. And man, the Belgians were brutal. They were brutal as far as how they colonized the Congo. So this takes place in the Congo, right? And they were brutal and slavery and all this stuff, right? And we touch upon this later in this episode, but I found it to be very educational. And at the same time, I also learned that The Heart of Darkness, the famous book, which was the inspiration for Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola, in the book, it actually takes place in the Congo, right? And it touches upon that whole history regarding the Congo and the Belgian colonizers and things of that nature. And yeah, and this episode goes into more details about that. So yes, this episode begins with Indiana being a lieutenant leading Africans in their fight against the Germans. Now, he doesn't retreat even though he's ordered by his superior officer to retreat. Instead, Indiana decides to continue fighting, and he ends up taking over a German machine gun, and they end up winning this battle, right? But the superior officer is upset because Indiana Jones defied orders, right? So initially, the superior officer was like, we're no match for these German machine guns, but Indiana Jones saw an opportunity because one of the machine guns jammed. So Indiana took that opportunity and he was able to use one of those machine guns against the Germans. The superior officer was upset, but Indiana doesn't get reprimanded for this. Instead, he gets promoted to captain because this was an important victory for the Belgians. Now, Indiana has to go to a destination called Cape Lopez in order to intercept some German machine guns, because these machine guns that the Germans have give them a huge advantage in this war. And a nice important detail, a nice little nuance that ties in to the first volume in this, or the first season for this show, was that Indiana Jones is riding to Lawrence from my favorite movie of all time, Lawrence of Arabia. So I thought that was cool because in the first volume or the first season, young Indiana Jones as a child befriends Lawrence before any of his epic historical adventures are even known or even go down. So I thought this was a nice little detail that I really appreciated. Again, this show is awesome at tying all these important historical figures and historical events into Indiana Jones's personal story. I love that. Now, in regards to this mission that Indiana has to go on, which is his destination at Cape Lopez to obtain those German machine guns, intercept them, there are huge threats to their safety, him and his men. I mean, it's basically like an 80% chance that you will die. And that's not even because of, say, the Germans shooting you and killing you, but just because of the jungle, just because of all the diseases and all the food, the water, a lot of stuff is deadly. And what ends up happening is that Indiana Jones and his men come across an entire village that has basically been killed because of smallpox. However, there is one survivor, a little child, a little boy. Now, immediately, Indiana Jones is empathetic. He wants to rescue this little boy. He wants to bring him along, but the superior officer is like, absolutely not, because of quarantine procedures. The boy may be infected with smallpox, and he may be a threat to their entire company. And of course, many individuals within Indiana Jones's unit protest this. They don't want to leave the boy behind, but they are forced to. And there's one particular comrade of Indiana Jones's that is really reluctant to leave the little boy behind. And this is an African comrade. This isn't to be confused with Remy. And mind you, Remy is going along on this voyage. I love Remy, but he is not pleasant in this episode because he is suffering. He is suffering as much as everybody else in Indiana Jones's company. Now, as they continue on their journey, many of the men in Indiana Jones's unit are dying. They're dying of fever. And just as predicted, many men would die on this journey. Now, what ends up happening is that the African soldier, Indiana Jones's African comrade, ends up bringing the boy. He was hiding him. Now, this puts Indiana Jones in a very difficult situation because he's contemplating, does he defy his commanding officer again, or does he do what he feels is right in his heart and basically fight to bring the boy along? Now, there was a really nice scene where some dialogue is exchanged that illustrates the conundrum that the Africans are in. And basically, Indiana Jones tells his African comrade that they're there in the Congo to get the Germans out of Africa so that the Africans can have a future. But Indiana Jones's African comrade says that you are not very smart, Indy, even though you're brave, etc., etc. And he says that the Belgians are there for the white people's future and that the Belgians want to own African soil. Now, this led me to check out more into the history because I wanted more context, right? This isn't just preaching. There's actual history here. And again, if you check out the documentary on the DVD release, you can see that the Belgians, man, they had one king named King Leopold, and he was brutal. He was brutal, a brutal colonizer of the Congo. There was slavery. There was genocide for rubber. However, probably one of the most twisted things about learning about this history, about this King Leopold, was that he wasn't even colonizing the Congo for Belgians. He was doing it for himself because the other his colleagues in the Belgian government weren't even aware of what the hell he was doing, right? So I thought that was pretty illuminating as far as the history and the brutality that the people of Congo had to endure, right? It was a personal colonization by this King Leopold. And ultimately, after the king's reign is done, the Belgians come in and they contribute more infrastructure. They made churches, hospitals, and schools, and they were there for 50 years. However, they kept the Congo beneath them. Right? They weren't allowed to attend college and things of that nature. And ultimately, we find out here in this scene with Indiana Jones and his African comrade from the Congo that he was forced into the Belgian army. And I like how he basically emphasizes that this little boy that he's hiding, that this little boy is the future of the Congo, the future of Africa. It was a great scene. This is why I think this show is amazing, because it has moments like this. It has heartfelt moments. It has thought-provoking moments. It has action. It has comedy. It is pure Indiana Jones. The spirit of Indiana Jones is in this show, even though Sean Patrick Flanery isn't portraying Indiana Jones like Harrison Ford. Nonetheless, this show is amazing. So the African, he refuses to give up the child because the superior officer is like, give me this child. He refuses to give up the child. He refuses to abandon the child because the superior officer basically wants to tie him to a tree so that he doesn't end up following him. And what ends up happening is basically Indiana Jones's African comrade is like, you're going to have to kill me. And hey, the superior officer's like, okay. But what ends up happening is that all the African soldiers in their company have the same sentiment. And they're like, you're going to have to kill all of us. And of course, you can't do that because then that would jeopardize the mission. So Indiana Jones, he takes it upon himself to basically contest the superior officer because the superior officer, he's ready to execute them all. But then Indiana Jones is like, hey, you're not thinking rationally. You're jeopardizing our mission. And Indiana Jones, he kind of ends up becoming the superior officer because ultimately the superior officer ends up getting sick and he's too weak to lead. So as the story continues, more men die of sickness. The superior officer, the general, is sick. And what's funny is that the general says, leave him behind, but Indiana Jones refuses. So this whole time, the general has been like, leave this person behind. they're sick, they're going to jeopardize our mission. But when it comes time for him to say, leave me behind, Indiana Jones refuses, because Indiana Jones, he's a better man. He has more compassion. He's not cold-hearted like the general. Now, ultimately, they end up getting to the boat. And once they get on this boat and begin their journey down the river, they're attacked by separatist rebels. So these separatist rebels, they don't have anything to do with the Germans. They don't have anything to do with the Belgians. And they start attacking the boat. And the little kid, the little boy, ends up saving everybody by steering the boat away from the separatists during all the chaos, during all the action, the shootout. And they come across this German hospital, and the general refuses to go to this hospital, even though the men are dying, even though he's sick, because he just doesn't trust any Germans. And as a result of not going to this hospital, more men die. Now, ultimately, they end up getting to their destination, but once they get there, the general dies. And he tells Indiana Jones, right before he dies, he says, blow up the German guns, if necessary, before the Germans get them. And he tells Indiana Jones, despite this, that he has no faith in Indiana Jones, because Indiana Jones is soft. And I thought that was a pretty cold way to die, right? Pretty cold way to die, and a pretty cold thing to say to Indiana. Now, what's sad is that the African soldier, Indiana Jones's African comrade from the Congo, ends up dying of his wounds that he endured from the boat shootout. And it's sad. It was a sad moment. It was very touching, sad. And Indiana Jones, he basically asks the French for extra men for their journey to East Africa, because they got to go back now. Now that they got the guns, they got to go back. But the French deny giving him any more men. And there was a funny exchange, man. Despite all the tragedy, despite the sadness, there was a funny exchange here, because Remy is just sick of it. Remy's like, I'm not going back. I'm not going to risk dying of disease. Screw this fool's errand. I'm not going to do this. And Indiana Jones decides to pull rank on his friend Remy. And then Remy just punches Indiana Jones in the face and says, yes, sir. Right? You got to see it in order to get the humor. Because when I say it, it's not funny at all. But it was hilarious. I loved it. So that brings us to the conclusion of the first episode in this quote-unquote movie. And the second part is interesting. I liked it, but I'm just going to gloss over this one really fast. So when Indiana Jones and his company went past that German hospital, and his superior officer, the general's like, don't go there. What ultimately ends up happening in this episode is that Indiana Jones ends up staying at this hospital. So Indiana Jones goes back on the river, because now he has to go to East Africa, and his men continue to die, and they end up at the German hospital. And Indiana Jones doesn't trust the doctor. Initially, he doesn't trust him at all, despite him, the doctor, saving Indiana Jones and Remy's and his other comrades' life. One sad thing here is that Remy lost 2 toes as a result of gangrene, and that was very unfortunate. And one thing that Indiana Jones is really, really shocked by is that this German doctor and his hospital, they are living harmoniously with the Africans, right? It's almost like they're a separate entity away from all the madness of war. And there's a lot of compelling and philosophical discussions between the Doctor and Indiana Jones. So in this episode, we slow things down. And again, just because we slow things down doesn't make this show boring. We have some episodes that are action for the most part, some episodes that are humorous, some full of drama. This one had a lot of discussion, a lot of philosophical discussion that made you think about war, right? And the Doctor says that society wants servants, not moral men. And what ends up happening is that the Doctor teaches Indiana Jones the value of life. And there's a lot of discussions like this throughout this episode. Unfortunately, the French come along and they discover this German hospital, and they decide to deport the German doctor and his wife and shut down this hospital because the French are basically deporting all German nationals. And Indiana Jones is furious. He feels like this is unjustified. And he even mentions his mission about the guns. And the French tell him, like, hey, the guns are no longer needed. So the objective was fulfilled even without Indiana Jones and him returning with those guns. And the sick are left to die. And Indiana Jones feels like this whole voyage through the Congo with his men dying was for nothing. It was all for nothing. And this further re-emphasizes the sentiments that the Doctor had, this kind of anti-war outlook on this world war. And Indiana Jones states that the bureaucrats will be the death of us all. He says that to the French. And at the end of this episode, it's decided by his Belgian superior officers that he will go back to fight the war in Europe. And thus, this ends Indiana Jones's adventures in Africa. Now, the next episode in this series is called Attack of the Hawkmen. And I thought it was another great episode filled with adventure and your typical Indiana Jones thrills. So, the beginning of this episode starts out with Indiana having joined Belgian intelligence, and he's unhappy with his current profession because he wants to join French intelligence. And there's also the other issue that the Belgians are poorly organized. So what eventually ends up happening is Remy and Indiana Jones are split up by the French. So Indiana goes to the Western Front working as a photographer. And the reason why he's taking photos, the purpose is for reconnaissance missions. So he's basically snapping photos for intel. And Remy ends up being a chef, right? But it's a front. In actuality, he's a spy, and he's a contact for the spy networks, in other words. So Indiana Jones has to go on a mission as a photographer for reconnaissance, but the thing is, it's on a plane, right? And it totally kind of catches Indiana Jones off guard because he didn't expect to be high in the sky flying with the pilots during their engagements with the enemy. But because of that, this episode is filled with dogfights galore. And that's what makes this a great episode, an exciting episode filled with lots of fun and adventure. If you're a fan of the dogfighting episode in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, you're going to be very pleased with this episode. And what ends up happening on one of the missions that Indiana Jones goes on, he and the pilot are shot down and captured by this German pilot badass. He's the top pilot in the German army, in the German Air Force rather, and he basically challenges the top pilot in the French Air Force to a duel, right? Eventually what ends up happening is Indiana Jones escapes, and the top pilot of the French and the top pilot of the Germans, they engage in this epic duel, which is basically a dogfight high in the sky. Awesome, exciting, fun adventure. And again, I gotta mention the special effects for a TV show in the early 90s is pretty good. It still holds up today, in my opinion, and it doesn't feel dated at all, in other words. Now, what ends up happening is the French pilot wins, but it has to be said that he barely survives, right? Barely survives. And that's kind of the end of the first half of this film, quote unquote. The second half begins with the United States entering the war And basically, Indiana Jones served his time as this reconnaissance photographer. And then Indiana Jones is assigned as a spy. And he basically has to jump out of a plane via parachute behind German enemy lines. And there's this whole theme of aircraft, traditional aircraft versus the Zeppelins, right? The Zeppelins that were very popular at this time as far as fighting in World War One. And I thought, yeah, again, I'm just really blown away by how immersive this series is, how I feel so immersed into this era of World War One. Now, one of the top engineers that Indiana Jones is basically trying to dissuade him from continuing to work with the Germans, but this top engineer, he does not care who he works for, right? And this kind of introduces this discussion, or I guess you want to say this deliberation, or this philosophical debate, if you will, as to whether good versus evil is relative, right? And Indiana Jones totally disagrees with the engineer's outlook on the whole situation, right? And what ultimately ends up happening is Indiana Jones takes some pictures of this new project that the Germans are working on with this engineer. And Indiana Jones is caught, and there's this huge, epic fight, right, near this Zeppelin. And as a result, what ultimately happens is there's this explosion, this huge explosion as a result of hydrogen being present. And then as a result of this explosion, the new project, the new plane is destroyed. So Indiana Jones was successful in preventing the Germans from their technological advancements as far as engineering this new plane. And again, it's exciting. Love this episode. Thought it was perfect as far as capturing that essence of Indiana Jones, that adventure, while at the same time being different, because he's not an archaeologist. He's just submersed in World War One. And I love how we get to see every aspect of the war, right? After this is the episode Adventures in the Secret Service. And I thought this was another outstanding episode, right? However, this episode was excellent to me, not because of the adventure and the action. In fact, this episode has very little action, right? What I loved about this episode was the subject matter that was addressed. Now, this episode deals with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia at the time, right? So we're talking about the advent of communism right here. And I love the way this is addressed in this show. I was totally blown away by how the subject matter was handled, right? And I subscribed to a lot of the sentiments in this episode because I've always been fascinated with this time, especially with the Bolshevik Revolution, right? I'm not a proponent of communism at all. In fact, I'm against communism in all its aspects. However, studying this time frame, especially the Bolshevik Revolution, is very important. And in fact, it's very sad that this stuff isn't taught in schools, right? This is completely overlooked in academia, and it's very unfortunate. And again, I'm not going to get too into it, but again, I am so grateful as to how this episode handled this subject matter. So, first thing, Christopher Lee's in this episode. We got Count Dooku himself present in this episode, and I'm a fan of anything Christopher Lee does. He's an outstanding actor, right? And like I previously said, you could totally perceive a little prequel DNA in this show, which I love, right? Now, the episode begins with Indiana Jones being a spy, trying to get to Austria in order to end the alliance with the Germans, right? Now, the Russian Tsar has been disposed by his own people due to the revolution happening, right? Now, what ends up happening is Indiana Jones is assigned as a Russian translator, and he's assigned to be in Russia in order to observe what's going on over there, right? Now, Indiana Jones doesn't think that Lenin and the Bolsheviks are going to take over. So everybody's anticipating the revolution at this time, but Indiana Jones doesn't think it's going to go down. Now, there is an awesome discussion in this episode between this man and a woman, and it just basically personifies everything I feel about communism and all that. So basically, the general idea of this discussion is whether we can have paradise on earth, right? And one of the people in this debate says that communism will never work because you cannot have paradise on earth. Paradise is not of this world, right? And I wholeheartedly agree. And this is why communism will always fail and will always end up into some kind of authoritarian government, right? You cannot have paradise on earth. Human beings are flawed. Human beings are inherently corrupt. And to think that you can have some kind of commune where everybody gets along and everybody is treated equally and everybody gets paid the same and everybody has the same outcome in life, it's ridiculous, right? Paradise is not of this earth, and that's why it'll never work. Not only that, but one man's paradise is another man's hell, right? What you think is paradise may not be what I think is paradise. We can never come to a general consensus as to what paradise is, or what the perfect state looks like, or the perfect government, or the perfect society, right? That's why communism never works. That's why it fails as soon as it's being enforced, because as soon as you try to enforce it, it's no longer communism. You have somebody, you have a hierarchy already, right? And if you think that Stalin, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, they're living off one bar of soap a month, eating one potato a day like the average person, you got another thing coming, right? Read Animal Farm by Orson Welles, right? You have the pigs who at first lead the revolution against the humans, right? Then it seems like it's a commune. It seems like it's a paradise for the animals because they got rid of the humans. Each animal specializes in a different job, right? But the pigs, they're sitting back, giving all the orders. Ultimately, what happens, long story short, the pigs end up being the authoritarians. They end up reconvening with the humans, making deals with the humans. The other animals are like, hey, wait a minute, I thought we rebelled against the humans. But the pigs are like, oh, it's necessary. It's necessary. Go back to plowing the fields. And then the other animals start to criticize the pigs like, well, wait a minute. How come you're dressed like humans? How come you're eating better than us? How come you're smoking? How come you're drinking? And they're like, oh, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. And then to all the other animals that start to question them, they get taken out. They get killed, right? Then they start to see that some animals are being treated better than others, and then they amend the Constitution. At first it said all animals are created equal. Well, then they amended that, and it said all animals are created equal. It's just that some animals are more equal than others, right? So that's my little footnote about Animal Farm by Orson Welles. Read that, and you'll totally understand my viewpoint on communism. Coming back to Indiana Jones after that tangent. Love that discussion was in this episode. Beautiful, right? I didn't expect that, right? So what ends up happening is the man disputes that we can't have paradise on earth, but the woman talks about how the world would be better if we had one world government, a new world order, one government to rule them all, aka globalism, right? So I'm not even going to touch that one. Hopefully, based on what I've been saying, you can reach my conclusion. I mean, you could you could deduce what my feelings are on globalism. All right. But enough with the politics. Indiana Jones has to basically shut down this woman that falls in love with him. It's unreciprocated love. It's sad because the woman she's very nice. I like her. But Indiana Jones doesn't have those feelings for her like that. And it was kind of sad. Now, what ends up happening is everybody is anticipating that the revolution is going to happen, right? However, it doesn't happen. Indiana Jones and his comrade, I guess you want to say, not comrade, but the co-worker that he has, they are arguing as to whether the revolution is going to happen or not. And one says it's not going to happen because Lenin is in Finland. The other one is saying it's going to happen regardless. Now, it kind of starts to boil over, right? It's alluded that the revolution is going to happen. People start to mobilize. There's social disruption. However, Lenin says now's not the time, right? And Indiana Jones tries to warn his friends, the friends that he's made, not to go to that rally. Don't attempt the revolution. Don't do it because the Russian army, they're on standby and they're ready to kill you. They're ready to shoot you. Unfortunately, that's what happens. So Indiana Jones loses some of his friends because they didn't want to listen to him. They were so caught up in that revolutionary fervor, and they didn't listen to him. And his friends end up getting killed. And it was sad. Again, this isn't your typical Indiana Jones adventure. There's not a lot of action. However, the subject matter was beautiful. It was brilliant. And I loved it. Thought it was great. Okay, now the next episode, which is called Espionage Escapades, sucks. It's awful. I don't like it. I thought it was boring. And there's just, it's like some weird thing about Picasso. And there's like this quirky kind of comedy thing. Kind of like, it's kind of has that vibe like that movie Clue based off the board game, or George Lucas's movie Radioland Murders. And I didn't like it at all. And this episode involves the famous painter Picasso, and I thought it was stupid. I was not entertained. I thought it was lame, and I recommend you skip it. I really don't have much to say about it as far as negative things. However, to its credit, it's not awful. It's not like, oh my God, this thing's so bad, it's cringe inducing. It's not like that. I just felt like it was boring, it was uninteresting, and it wasn't funny. So that's all I'm going to say about that. However, the next episode after this is called Daredevils of the Desert, and it was another home run. I loved it. And the thing about this episode, we get a lot of famous actors in this episode. We get Daniel Craig, who played James Bond. We get Catherine Zeta-Jones, who was in movies like, let me think, the first Zorro film with Antonio Banderas, Entrapment with Sean Connery, and I believe, what was the one that with Michael Douglas and Benicio del Toro? Oh, Traffic. That was great. That was a great film. And another important thing to note about this episode is that it's written by Frank Darabont, director of the masterpiece Shawshank Redemption. So yeah, this episode has a lot of good things going for it, right? And what I love about this episode especially is that this episode kind of overlaps with the movie Lawrence of Arabia, or maybe not the movie, but the events that inspired that film, right? And if you know me, you know that that's my favorite film of all time, period. No exceptions. Lawrence of Arabia is the greatest movie ever made, in my opinion, right? So you know I'm going to love this episode. So this episode is about Indiana Jones and his colleagues, his his constituents, his allies in the war, trying to take Beersheba, right? However, the notion of crossing the desert is pure insanity, and people feel like it's impossible. So again, it kind of ties into Lawrence of Arabia, because those sentiments were there as well. Now, this episode is all about fighting against the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, and what ends up happening is Lawrence, from Lawrence of Arabia. So Lawrence and Indiana Jones are close friends. Another thing that I love about this show. And Lawrence requests Indiana Jones's help in achieving this mission, which is to take Beersheba, right? Now, the way Indiana Jones is able to succeed at his mission is that he was able to fool the Turks into thinking that the British were going after Gaza. And an important thing to note about this episode is Indiana Jones has support from the Australians. And what ends up happening in regards to Catherine Zeta-Jones's role is that she ends up being a spy for the Turks. So initially, her and Indiana Jones are together. It appears that they're going to work together. And I just got to say really quick, she is absolutely gorgeous in this episode. She's just mind-blowing. But she ends up being a spy, so it's a total double cross. She actually works for the Turks. And in regards to Daniel Craig, he is basically the main villain as far as the Germans. So the Germans, they're working together with the Turks because they're allies in the war. And he's the big baddie as far as the Germans. And they end up failing because Indiana Jones and his comrades, his allies, were able to fool the Turks into thinking that the attack was going to be at Gaza and not Beersheba. And they were able to be successful in this mission. And again, I love this episode, filled with lots of fun, filled with lots of adventure, great acting, awesome spectacle, amazing set design, great special effects for the time. Pure Indiana Jones goodness here. Now, that episode brings us to the end of the box set, the second box set in this series. So volume 2, The Warriors, is over. And next is, I got a handful of episodes from the third volume that I absolutely love. It has one of my favorite episodes, The Treasure of the Peacock's Eye, which is classic Indiana Jones. However, volume 3 doesn't start out too strong. The episode Tales of Innocence, I'm really not a fan of the first half, which is basically some silly kind of love story comedy between Indiana Jones and this other guy trying to compete for this woman's love. And she comes from a background. She's basically like a socialite. She's rich, her family, they're very judgmental. And Indiana Jones and this other soldier are competing for her love. And they go back and forth between their bickering and their antics. And what ends up happening is she doesn't choose any of them, right? She doesn't choose Indiana Jones, and she doesn't choose Indiana Jones's friend. And the whole comedic aspect was, at first, Indiana Jones thinks he's competing with a stranger, and he's not aware. He's not aware that the person he's actually competing with is his friend. So they're both going back and forth talking about this guy that they're competing with to win this woman's affections, but they don't know it's each other, right? It wasn't laugh out loud funny. It was mildly amusing. However, I will say that it's not as bad as Espionage Escapades, the episode with Picasso in Volume 2. But again, it's not that thrilling. It's not that good of an episode. Or the first half, right? So the first half of Tales of Innocence is not that good. However, the second half is good, right? And again, this is what makes editing 2 episodes together to make a quote-unquote movie. It's just not a good idea because this happens, right? So the second half of this movie, which is really, in theory, an entirely different episode, is great. I loved it. So Indiana Jones goes to Casablanca. He has a mission there. And there's this awesome scene where he sets this guy on fire by drinking 100 proof schnapps and lighting up a cigarette, right? And I was like, whoa, that's pretty brutal, right? But it was a great episode. And basically, this episode is about trying to find out who is the traitor among them, because somebody is smuggling guns to the enemy. And then at the end of the episode, it turns out being the one guy that you thought it wasn't. So it actually turns out being one of the high commanding officers in the army that Indiana Jones is collaborating with. And the way he was able to find this out was by kind of being a detective, right? And yeah, so the second half of the episode was great. The first half was some silly romantic comedy, which kind of makes the movie silly because it's split in half. The tones are totally different, right? But moving on, the next episode, which is called Mask of Evil, again has that issue where the two different episodes being edited into one movie make the movie feel ridiculous as far as the shift in tone, right? So the first half of this movie is on some spy, espionage, tragedy, romantic tragedy. And then the second half is like a horror kind of comedy, right? Maybe not comedy, but it has this whole like horror, haunted house kind of vibe, right? Almost like a little bit kind of like some Abbott and Costello thing going on, but not as comedy driven, right? Now, I like the episodes. I like both these episodes. However, putting them together as a movie it's weird, right? But I recommend this movie because the two episodes are great, right? So the first half starts out with Indiana Jones as a spy working for a newspaper, and basically the zeitgeist right here in this environment or during this time is that there's some nationalists among the Turks and the Ottoman Empire that are causing issues. So there's nationalist sentiments within the Ottoman Empire, right? And ultimately that's what happens at the end of World War One. Right? So the Ottoman Empire is no longer existing, and instead we have these countries emerging: Iraq, Syria, etc., right? All that stuff used to be the Ottoman Empire, right? All of it. It was vast. It was huge, right? But now you have individuals within the Ottoman Empire that want to be their own country, in other words, right? Now, this episode also has a love story, and it's kind of tragic because Indiana Jones ends up using this woman just to use her, just to advance his mission, and he feels bad about it, especially because she ends up dying, right? It was a total bummer. Indiana Jones feels terrible about it, and he did have feelings for her. He didn't just use her ruthlessly and didn't care about her. He did have feelings for her. However, it's one of those kind of tropes where it was too late. He started out being the spy. He started out being dishonest in order to advance his mission, and then he caught feelings for her, but it was too late, right? He had to do his mission, and he caught feelings after the whole dishonesty phase, if you will, right? And ultimately, this episode ends with Indiana Jones finding out that his colleague, his most trusted ally in this episode, ends up being a traitor, right? Then the second half of this movie, which is in theory an entirely different episode, it's about Vlad the Impaler, who was the inspiration for Count Dracula, being like Indiana Jones and his friends. They go to Vlad the Impaler's old mansion or castle or something like that, and it's haunted, and he still exists, and he's like a ghost, and he's been like possessing the people that have mysteriously gone missing there. And it's just kind of weird and kind of jarring. Not only is it jarring as far as being edited with this other episode, which is about being a spy. It's just weird as far as like being a part of this series in general. Now, I will be honest. At first, I was like, this is kind of dumb. But by the time the episode ended, I was like, well, it was kind of fun. It was kind of fun. I mean, it totally reminded me of like Night at the Museum or something like that. But like kind of going for some like light family horror vibe, right? So if I had to categorize this episode about Vlad the Impaler's ghost haunting Indiana Jones and his friends in his castle, it would be kind of like family, kind of like a family film, Halloween special. I don't know, right? It's weird, but I'm not going to lie. I enjoyed it. I ended up enjoying it. Once it was over, I was like, okay, that was cool. Kind of weird, kind of jarring as far as how it stands out from all the other episodes, but it's not as bad as Espionage Escapades was. Now, this brings me to the last episode that I'm going to review, and it's my favorite episode, even more so than those awesome World War I fighting in the trenches episodes. And the reason for this is because this episode, it actually feels like the Indiana Jones films, right? Because this is Indiana Jones going on a treasure hunting adventure, and it feels like this could be Indiana Jones 5 or 6, right? Whatever. But I don't count the what was it called? Spear of Destiny. I don't count that as Indiana Jones, right? So this is just an outstanding episode where Indiana Jones goes on a classic adventure like he does in the movies, right? And I loved it. I thought it was fun, exciting. And even though at the very end, Indiana Jones doesn't get the treasure that he was seeking, that MacGuffin, there is a lesson to be learned for Indy. And that lesson was the reason why he became an archaeologist. And I love that. So even though he didn't get the MacGuffin, he realized that getting this treasure isn't what life's about, right? And it's not going to make him happy, right? Because initially, Indiana Jones and his partner Remy, they think that getting this treasure is going to transform their lives into some kind of like never-ending happiness. They're going to be filthy rich, etc., etc. But as they go on their journey, Indiana Jones learns differently. And I thought that was amazing. That was the true treasure that Indiana Jones found. It was that lesson. And then ultimately, again, this lesson is what led him to be Indiana Jones, because he became an archaeologist, right? So this episode begins with the war ending, right? The guns have fallen silent for the last time, right? And it's the end of the war and everybody's celebrating. Remy and Indiana were reunited, and this was the last time they had to fight in the trenches together, and they are so delighted that the war is finally over, right? So Indiana Jones going on this adventure because a corporal that was dying right at the end of the war said something mentioning the treasure of the peacock's eye, right? So it was this corporal that passed away. And what ends up happening is that Indiana and Remy, they find a map to the eye of the peacock, which is a diamond that once belonged to Alexander the Great. Now, Indiana Jones and Remy, they decide to go on this adventure to get the peacock's eye, to get this treasure, because they want to be rich, right? So initially the goal was one of greed, if you will, right? And Remy, he's super greedy, right? I love Remy. Remy's such a great character. He's one of the greatest Indiana Jones sidekicks. I love him. I think he's hilarious. And I love how he goes from 0 to 100. He could be jolly and then he could be absolutely furious. And it just happens like like that. And I love his character. He's great, right? So as they go on this wild goose chase, their first stop is in London. And there, Indiana Jones, he basically wants to visit his old teacher, Miss Seymour, but he finds out that she passed away, and it was a tragic moment, right? However, as the episode moves on, Indiana Jones and Remy head out to Alexandria, Egypt, because they think that could be the starting point in finding the treasure that they're seeking. However, once they get there, they realize that they are basically in a race to get the treasure of the peacock's eye, and this race is being conducted with a character, a one-eyed German explorer named Zeke, right? And this is the same individual that shot the colonel, who was the one that originally gave Remy and Indiana Jones the whole idea to seek the treasure of the peacock's eye, right? So once Indiana Jones arrives at Alexandria, he meets up with famous archaeologist Howard Carter, who offers him a job on the Tutankhamun excavation. However, Indiana Jones rejects this because, again, he's looking for the treasure of the peacock's eye. However, this famous archaeologist reminds Indiana Jones of his initial passions, because he asks him, he says, "Didn't you want to be an archaeologist?" And then Indiana Jones is like, "Yeah, I do, but I'm going on this adventure," right? He doesn't necessarily say adventure, but that's what he's feeling. And this is going to tie in later once he realizes that treasure hunting is not what his passion is really about, right? It's not about getting rich and all that stuff. And this initial conversation that he has with this famous archaeologist, it's like a little seed being implanted in him that's going to grow later throughout this adventure. But like I said, he declines to work on the excavation for Tutankhamun because he's more interested in finding the treasure of the peacock's eye. Now, ultimately what happens, this one-eyed German explorer is able to steal the map that Indiana Jones and Remy are able to obtain. And then Remy and Indiana Jones start to follow the one-eyed German guy. And this actually leads them to going on this cruise ship. And Indiana Jones befriends this great female character. I really liked her. She had a lot of spunk and a lot of fire to her. Her name is Lily. And she was a great character, and she's one of those females that has a lot of heart and fire to her, and she reminds me of Marion Ravenwood. And it's really unfortunate and sad that she dies in this adventure. She gets killed once some pirates try to rob all the goods that are on the ship, and they end up taking the treasure of the peacock's eye. So I forgot to mention, so Remy and Indy think they found the treasure of the peacock's eye, and they're basically chasing after this box, this little box that's like a cube, and this is the big MacGuffin in this story, right? And they got this box from the one-eyed German explorer, and there was this whole exchange who has the key, and the German explorer had the key. He wore it around his neck, and then we go back and forth between Indiana stealing the key, but the German explorer, the one-eyed guy, he has the box. So the whole idea is to bring them together so that you can unlock the box and get the treasure inside the peacock's eye, right? Turns out that Lily I forgot whether she had the key this whole time or she had the box this whole time. But ultimately what ends up happening is the pirates take the box, and Indiana decides to chase after the pirates. Like I previously stated, Lily isn't able to make it. She dies, she gets killed, she gets shot. She was an awesome character. I wish she lived longer, man. And so Remy and Indiana go after the pirates. And this episode has a lot of locations. And I thought that was awesome because, again, it reminds me of the Indiana Jones movie. So we get a lot of location jumping. We're going from country to country and great locations, a wide variety of different cultures. And ultimately what ends up happening is Indiana Jones and Remy end up stranded on this island filled with these natives. And it's very appropriate that this happens, especially to Indiana Jones, because he witnesses two different native cultures, right, engaging in this ritual that ends up with one male member of the tribe dying. And Indiana Jones is like, why are you guys doing this if you don't have to do this, right? Why are you fighting one another? And it turns out that they're not doing this because they don't like each other. These two tribes, it's not that they hate each other or something like that. It's that they're doing it because they feel like the gods demand it, right? And then this perplexes Indiana Jones. And again, it's more motivation to get into the archaeology and understand the anthropological perspective on life, right? How an outsider can view the traditions of a culture as completely ludicrous, but if you take an anthropological perspective, there's greater understanding and you have to respect those cultures, right? So Indiana Jones also runs into this other archaeologist on this island. So initially, Remy and Indiana Jones think they're on this island by themselves. They're the only, whatever, not by themselves, but that they're the only individuals from the Western world, from the quote unquote civilized world. But they come across this anthropologist who's been on the island chronicling the traditions of the cultures. And it's when Indiana Jones meets this individual that he realizes that the pursuit of treasures for riches is not what he wants. It's not what's going to make him happy. It's not his passion. It's not why he exists. It's not his dream, in other words, and he realizes this. Remy, on the other hand, he is furious. He's upset. Remy wants treasures. Remy wants riches. And they finally get the box open, and it's just a rock with writing on it, right? So it's another wild goose chase, another map, another clue, right? It's not the peacock's eye itself. Remy's pissed off. However, after he cools down, he wants Indy to go on this adventure. Let's continue the adventure. Let's keep looking for the treasure of the peacock's eye. We'll be rich. But Indiana Jones says, no, I don't want to do that. We almost died. We risked our lives. And this is not ultimately what's going to make me happy. I'm going to go back to America and I'm going to study archaeology, anthropology, right? And that's how this episode ends. And one thing that I thought was a brilliant Easter egg is that the treasure of the peacock's eye is actually found in the beginning of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So that sequence when Indiana Jones is in China and he's fighting I guess you want to say the triads or the gangsters, the Chinese gangsters for that diamond, that is the treasure of the peacock's eye. That's the peacock's eye. So I love how it all connects. I thought that was brilliant. This was one of the best episodes in the entire show, arguably probably top 3, if not the best. And I'm going to conclude my review of this series with that, because this was my favorite episode. And I encourage all of you to check out the entire show. It's great. In fact, there's an episode that I'm not going to review, and it's in volume 3. And it actually has Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones in the introduction. So he's narrating the story and he sets the whole story up. And it is so great to see Harrison Ford return as Indiana Jones. And one of the most awesome things is that he's young, right? I don't have to wait till he's in his 60s like we had to do with Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. So this is our last glimpse of a middle-aged Indiana Jones, and I love that. Another thing that I have to mention, only because it's such a good episode, It's the episode called The Winds of Change, and this is about the Treaty of Versailles, and Indiana Jones is right there witnessing the whole thing. It is an awesome episode, highly educational, and it really gave me a great comprehensive view of how the treaty went down and why the Germans were blamed for World War I, despite all the other nations involved, that, despite the assassination of the Duke of Austria-Hungary by the Serbian national. I mean, it was great. And it also shows the controversy of this treaty, right? And the implications of how it's going to impact history and lead to another war, World War II, which in fact it did. So that's an amazing episode, and I just had to mention that. The Winds of Change. Great episode. Well, that concludes my review and in-depth analysis of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy the analysis, please like, subscribe, and share. One love, people. Take care.